ready? Put on your headphones and join me in watching the next part of the Red-Shirted Demon episode. If you find it interesting, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that Nightmare Ones can be more complete. Thank you for listening. And next, I won't keep you waiting long. Let's get started. He chose another shirt from the closet, put it on the old man, and asked, "Why don't you put on a shirt and just go shirtless like that? You'll catch a cold." "Where's the shirt I gave you earlier?" Mr. Cam kept smiling, then suddenly said, "Give me back the red shirt, son. I only wear red shirts." What Mr. Cam said was like a cold wind blowing through Duan. Duan suddenly felt a shiver, but also tears welled up. Duan gently flattered the old man. "Tomorrow I will buy you a new, more beautiful and expensive red shirt, okay?" Duan mentioned the red shirt, deliberately speaking loudly to see if Mrs. Diem would wake up and start cursing. But there was no response. Mrs. Diem must have been in a deep sleep. Duan held the old man's hand and talked with him while waiting for the long night to pass until it was time to go to the communal house to meet Trang. Duan talked to Old Man Cam as if he was talking to himself. As for Old Man Cam, he kept chewing betel. A red liquid kept flowing from his mouth. Every now and then, Duan had to use a handkerchief to wipe his mouth to clean it. Smelling the strong smell of betel juice, Duan said, "Tomorrow I will go to the back garden to cut a new bunch of areca nuts for you. This areca nut has been left for too long and it smells fishy. Estimated time." Trang finished practicing performing arts. Duan excitedly stood up to greet Mr. Cam. "I have to go. Go to bed early or you'll be tired." Having said that, Duan went out, closed the door, and bolted it to keep the wind out of the old man's room. Then he took his bicycle and went to the village's temple to meet Trang. Inside the room, Mr. Cam suddenly stood up and opened the door a crack to look at Duan's figure. He stopped laughing. Suddenly the red slime in his mouth fell out. Alas, that was not the betel nut he usually chewed. But unexpectedly it was an eye that had been chewed to pieces with a long line of flesh and blood stuck to it. As if he had just dropped a treasure, Mr. Cam hurriedly rushed over to pick up the eye, stuffed it in his mouth, and chewed it greedily, as if he was afraid someone would fight over it. He sat down on the edge of the bed and laughed absent-mindedly like before. The room returned to silence. Only the crackling sound coming from his mouth remained. Duan rode his bike to the end of the village road and saw Trang looming at the gate of the village shrine. But Duan was not happy because he discovered that not only Trang was there, but Kong was also there. He saw Kong aggressively rubbing against Trang. He quickly rode his bike to the front of the shrine. He threw the bike aside and rushed into the shrine. Kong was grinning widely when he saw Duan charging towards him fiercely, and his face turned pale. At this moment, there was no other young man around Kong to rely on. Normally, Kong would bully Duan just because he relied on the crowd. Now, alone and helpless, Kong's strength was not as good as Duan's. Because Duan was tall, big, and muscular, his body was full of calluses, and his shoulders were stubby and muscular. Kong was just a weak, small artist who practiced opera all day, so he was no match for him. Seeing Duan getting mad, Trang tried to resist him. So Kong immediately said something to ease the embarrassment. "Is Mr. Duan going to the temple to play?" "I just finished explaining the play to Trang, so I'm going home." Seeing Trang scared and with tears in her eyes, Duan punched Kong in the face. "Change this!" Kong coughed up blood and fell to the ground. He quickly covered his mouth and ran away. As he walked, he kept saying, "You bastard! Remember my face!" Seeing Kong had run away, Duan breathed a sigh of relief and then approached Trang, stammering, "Are you okay?" Trang blushed and bowed her head without saying anything. She sat down at the base of an old tree near the temple, waving for Duan to come sit next to her. Duan shyly approached, but still sat a distance away from Trang. The two did not say a word to each other. Duan was sweating with fear because he thought he had done something wrong to make Trang angry. He was about to speak when Trang immediately raised her voice. "Have you read the paper I gave you?" Suddenly remembering the piece of paper in his breast pocket, he quickly reached into his pocket, scratched his head, and was about to open it to read when Trang grabbed it and said, "Don't read it. I'm shy." Trang's voice was gentle. Duan's whole body was numb. After a while, he stammered to explain. "When I got home, I was so excited, I intended to save it here to read." but I completely forgot. Trang pushed Duan lightly and said, "Why are you such a big man but such a coward? You were yelling so loudly just now." Duan scratched his head and ears, stammering, You. Seeing Duan's weak voice, Trang was delighted and smiled brightly. She stuffed the piece of paper back into Duan's hand and said, "Here, read it, but don't tell anyone, understand?" Trang finished speaking. Duan quickly took the piece of paper, straining his eyes to read the words under the moonlight. Unexpectedly, before he could read a single sentence, a shout suddenly rang out from all around. "Oh my God, it's murder! It's murder! Catch the murderer!" Duan stood up abruptly, quickly stuffed the piece of paper into his pocket, then pulled Trang's hand and said, "Let me take you home, then I'll run out and check. It's dangerous for you to be here alone at this hour." Trang listened to Duan and climbed into the carriage, intending to let Duan take her home. But as soon as they reached the temple gate, a group of men, women, old and young, all carrying torches, were running towards them from the village road. Leading the way was Kong, who was agitating and shouting to the villagers. As soon as Kong saw Duan driving out of the temple gate, he pointed straight at Duan's face and shouted, "He is the murderer! The murderer! The ungrateful type!" The villagers glared and rushed forward, pulling Duan off the bike and pinning him to the ground. I don't know how many people rushed in and beat Duan up. Duan held his sore mouth and urged, "Beat him to death, you disloyal and unfilial son of a bitch." Trang saw Duan being beaten by the villagers for no reason, so she rushed out to stop him and said, "Everyone stop. Mr. Duan did not commit any crime that you all beat him like that." Kong ran to pull Trang towards him and said, as if giving an order, "Stay away from him. He's a murderer. Don't stand next to him. It's dangerous." Trang jerked her hand away from Kong and then angrily pointed at Kong's face and said, "You are the one who puts fire in someone else's hand. You were beaten by Mr. Duan, so you wrongly accused him, right? Why are you so evil?" The situation became chaotic. Duan was beaten by the villagers, not knowing whether he would live or die. It was only after a while that the village chief led the militia to stop everyone from beating Duan. But in the end, Duan's fate remained the same. He was tied up by the militia and dragged to the village headquarters. When Duan escaped from being beaten by the villagers, it was the militia's turn to angrily question him. "If you confess honestly and quickly, you will be given leniency. Otherwise, you will be convicted of a serious crime and get shot 10 times. Duan stammered, "Yes, sir. You must be mistaken. I didn't kill anyone." The militiaman slapped the table and said, "You've come this far, and you're still denying it?" Duan was still bewildered and did not understand why he was suddenly beaten to death by the villagers. He was still in a difficult situation when he reached the village headquarters and was forced to open his mouth to be interrogated like this. It was only a while later that Duan realized what had happened. Mrs. Diem was dead. His biological mother, who had always been so vicious towards Duan like an animal, was dead. And obviously Mrs. Diem's bad reputation was well known throughout the village and alleys. Now that she had died so miserably, Duan was definitely the #1 suspect. Without Kong needing to provoke him, all the crimes were already placed on Duan's head. Diem died in her bedroom, strangled. Not only that, her eyes were gouged out, revealing deep black eye sockets. At the scene, people saw scattered furniture and signs of her struggle. So someone must have killed her, not committed suicide. The motive for the crime in the village was none other than Duan. Not only that, Mrs. Diem's nagging was also dug up by some villagers to convict Duan. I heard. When Mr. Ko was still alive, he had an affair with a distant cousin and was discovered by Mrs. Diem. At that time, Mrs. Na Diem was pregnant with Duan. Since Duan was born, Mrs. Diem remembered that incident and hated him very much. This Diem also slept with Mr. Luke to get revenge on Mr. Ko and gave birth to Ba. That made Mr. Ko so angry that he vomited blood and died. Since the day Mr. Ko died, she began to torture Duan even more viciously. When the water is too high, the bank will break. No wonder he hanged himself and killed his mother. But gouging out his eyes is too cruel and immoral. After all, she is my biological mother, and yet, who told Mr. Ko to beat Mrs. Diem so much when he was alive, so that when she died, Mrs. Diem would torture Duan? It's all just because of family matters that they kill each other. Isn't that miserable? The villagers said those words reached Duan's ears. It made him realize why people insisted that he was the murderer. The village chief knocked on the table for Duan to concentrate and said, "I heard your mother was planning to bring Mr. Luke and his illegitimate son, Ba, home. Was this the reason why you got angry and killed her?" Duan shook his head and said, "Yes, sir, I do have one." The village chief slapped the table and shouted, "Where were you when the murder happened? What evidence do you have to deny the crime?" Duan was so angry that he cried and said, "Yes, I'm going to the village temple. You were the one who caught me out there." As soon as Duan finished speaking, Kong suddenly rushed in from the crowd of villagers outside the headquarters and shouted, "That guy is lying, uncle. He went to the temple last night and then came home and killed his mother. Then, still not over his madness, he ran to the temple and beat me up, still swearing, if not him, then who?" As he spoke, Kong pointed to the swollen corner of his mouth, showing the obvious evidence of Duan's brutality. He didn't know how to take revenge. What happened gave him the opportunity to vent all his anger on Duan. He was determined to use this obvious evidence to force Duan to admit to the murder before he would be satisfied. Duan was both laughing and crying. Because of his one punch, Kong now used it as evidence to convict him. Some villagers, after hearing this, even more believed that Kong's argument was correct, that after Duan killed Mrs. Diem, he still had not run out of murderous blood, so he went to the communal house to beat Kong so hard that his mouth was torn open. The surrounding people were talking loudly. Someone picked up a rock and threw it at Duan, cursing, "You are an immoral man, and you still deny your crime. I will kill you." The stone was like a huge thing thrown into the calm river, causing the water to churn and boil. The villagers rushed into the village headquarters and assaulted Duan. The situation was so chaotic that the village chief was crushed, face down on the ground. The village chief shouted in fear, "Where are the village militia? Quickly escort the murderer to the commune headquarters, or the villagers will beat him to death." Luckily, Duan's body was strong and sturdy, but no matter how hard he was hit, it was ineffective. Despite the numerous elbows aimed at his face, Duan remained calm, only slightly stunned for a moment before being dragged away by the militia. Duan was arrested. Kong stayed next to Trang to add, "This guy killed his mother and gouged out her eyes. His crime was extreme. Whoever was unlucky enough to marry him would have lost their entire life." Trang was absent-minded, treating Kong's words like a hornet buzzing in her ears. She sympathized with Duan's fate of having a mother with a cruel personality. She also sympathized with him for falling into such a miserable situation. Trang's father, Han, heard the news and was told by Kong that Trang had feelings for Duan, so he was very angry and forbade Trang from ever seeing Duan again. Otherwise, he would disown her and not consider her as his daughter. Duan was locked up at the commune headquarters for a day, then taken to the district police station for investigation. No one knows what happened next, but after Diem's funeral, Duan was released. The village chief set up a loudspeaker at the front of the communal house to announce that the investigation concluded that Duan had not committed any crime. "Everyone, pay attention. The district police have clear investigation results. The real murderer who killed Miss Diem has not been identified yet. But the police investigation has confirmed that Mr. Duan is not the murderer. Therefore, the government hopes that people will not have unfounded suspicions that will affect Mr. Duan's life." When the news was released, the villagers quieted down. Instead of hating Duan, people started to sympathize with him. Some were happy for Duan because he had escaped from his cruel mother. It was thought that Duan's life would be freed and he would turn a new page. But unexpectedly, the days that followed were a deep, muddy pit, making his life darker and darker. The death of Mrs. Diem has become a huge mystery, a topic of discussion. Who killed her? She was cruel, but only towards Duan. But with the people around her, she was also quite friendly and enthusiastic. The fact that the killer has not been identified makes many people very uneasy. That person is still at large and has not been caught. Will he kill another person, and who will that victim be? People feel scared because danger lurks all around. Anyone can become the prey of a killer. Since returning from town, Duan passed by the village temple. He saw Trang still practicing her art. Trang's eyes looked at Duan strangely. Perhaps after the incident the day before, Trang had encountered some incident, heard that Mr. Han forbade her from seeing him. Suddenly remembering that he had not had time to read the piece of paper, Duan quickly opened it and read it. After reading the lines on the piece of paper, Duan's eyes were filled with tears. Trang had confessed her love to him, but the incident had separated the two of them. Trang glanced at Duan, then quickly turned away. Kong saw Duan and intentionally interrupted, leading the young men to cause trouble. "What are you doing here? Get lost. There's no room for you to look." Duan bowed his head in disappointment and sadness. He was sad not because Kong's group caused trouble, but because Trang's feelings seemed to have changed. But he did not know that Trang's feelings had not actually diminished at all. Perhaps it was only because of Mr. Han's prohibition that forced her to ignore Duan in front of everyone. She planned to go find Duan after the performance and explain. When Duan got home, he saw Mr. Luke leading Ba over. Carrying a bag of luggage, he sat down outside the gate. Mr. Luck sat chewing grass. Ba's face was haggard. Duan was surprised and angry and asked, "Why are you here?" Mr. Luke smiled and said, "My house is chained by the creditor. Now I'm going back to my wife's house. Are you going to forbid me?" Duan pointed out into the field and said, "You go live in the fields. Which house is your wife's house?" "Nonsense." Mr. Luck stood up straight, his muscular back extended, and rushed towards Duan, threatening. "Diem and I were about to get married when she unfortunately died. She was half my wife. And my child and her child are sitting here. My child must go back to her mother's house." Mr. Luke pointed at Ba and spoke harshly. "This man's house." Duan suddenly opened his eyes wide and punched Mr. Luck straight in the face. Seeing the fight, the neighbors started to peek over to see what was going on. Mr. Luck knew there was movement. Seeing that Duan was still angry, he got in the water. "I saw you just got back from the camp, so I didn't mess with you. I'll come over tomorrow if you don't let me in. Don't blame me." After saying that, Mr. Luke pulled Ba away. Ba exclaimed in surprise, "Dad, why don't we go inside?" Mr. Luck grumbled, "Ask your crazy brother." Then Mr. Luck and his son disappeared. Duan tiredly pushed the gate open to the yard. Suddenly remembering Mrs. Diem, he ran to her room first to ask after her. But when he opened the door, Mrs. Diem was nowhere to be seen. She had gone somewhere. Duan suddenly thought that he had been out of the house for a few days. Perhaps his aunt or uncle had heard the news and had taken Mrs. Cam home for a few days to take care of her. He sat down on the bed and fell asleep. He didn't know when it had gotten dark. Duan woke up feeling sad and had no interest in cooking. He thought of Trang. His whole body was sad, and he covered his face and cried. Duan slammed his fist down on the bed and growled, cursing Kong to vent his anger. "Kong, you and I have no grudge, but you insist on making things difficult for me." Trang. Duan was covering his face and crying when suddenly he felt a hand patting his back and asking, "Why is your grandson crying like this?" Duan raised his head and saw Mr. Cam. He was chewing betel and smiling gently. Duan quickly wiped away the tears on his cheeks. He spoke in a covert manner. "There's some dust in my eye. I'm not crying. Have you had dinner yet?" The old lady just nodded and then sat down again, smiling absent-mindedly. Duan thought that the old man was confused and did not know whether he had eaten or not. He still ran down to the kitchen and brought him food and water as usual. Usually Mrs. Diem forced Mrs. Cam to eat, but she refused to eat. But the food was cooked and brought up by her nephew. Every meal, she ate. Sometimes she even ate 2 bowls and drank a sip of soup. It was not that she could not eat. It was just that Mrs. Diem had mistreated her too much. Duan thought about Mr. Luck, then thought about Ba. He sighed. Well, Mr. Luck was a bad person, but Ba was known to be obedient and studious. After all, he was Duan's half-brother. Thinking about Ba's future fate, if he followed Mr. Luck, he would probably become nothing. He then told Mr. Cam, "In a few days, both Luke and Ba will probably come here to stay. We have to give them a room inside, sir." Mr. Cam suddenly asked, "Do you like living with them?" Duan honestly replied, "When my mother was still alive, she wanted to marry Mr. Luck. I was so angry. I hated him too, but now he is so miserable, and Ba is also my younger brother. It won't work if we don't let them stay, sir." Toothless old man Cam chewed betel and said, "Don't let them stay." The old man only said one sentence like that and then fell silent. Duan did not understand what he meant. After finishing the meal, Duan cleared the dishes and brought them down. Old Man Cam's eyes followed his grandson's back and then showed a vicious look.